Politics Naturalized, David Hume. Part 2. Property, Government, Justice and Contract. Hume believes that he has shown that an enlarged conception of self-interest lies at the root of our notion of justice, but that in itself doesn't explain why we attach the moral attributes of praise to the observation of justice and blame to its derogation. Hume's explanation is to appeal to sympathy, to show why, when particular instances of justice can in no way personally affect us, we still are displeased. As he writes, thus self-interest is the original motive to the establishment of justice, but a sympathy with public interest is the source of the moral approbation which attends that virtue. In passing, it should be noted that both Hume and Smith make much of the notion of sympathy in their moral theories. For Hume, sympathy is a more or less natural response to the situation of others, which is communicated to us pretty much mechanically. For Smith, on the other hand, any sympathy we may have with another beyond the obvious wince when, say, we see somebody suffer a blow, requires an effort of imagination. Sympathy, then, for Hume is passive, for Smith, active. For Hume, the sentiments we have are just the sentiments we have. For Smith, there is always a question of whether the sentiments we have are appropriate. And this question is made possible by Smith's idea of the impartial spectator. Finally, Hume is, in the end, a consequentialist, and Smith is not. Happiness for Smith is not something that can be defined in some brute physical way apart from moral components. Happiness is intrinsically connected with having the right moral dispositions. How are we to determine what property goes to whom? The initial allocation of property is to be based on whatever it is that people currently possess. Hume remarks that first possession always engages the attention most, and did we neglect it, there would be no colour of reason for assigning property to any succeeding possession. We possess not only what is actually within our grasp, but whatever it is that is within our power to use, move or destroy. This is, like many other things, a matter of more or less, and shades off at the extremities. First possession, then, gives title, or where first possession is obscure, if those who are in de facto possession have been so over a long period of time, then they acquire title by prescription. In an indirect reference to Locke, Hume considers the claim that the mixing of labour is the criterion of ownership, but remarks that, at best, such a criterion covers a limited number of cases. There are many instances in which we make use of things in a manner that involves no mixing of labour at all, or if so, only in a metaphorical or attenuated and figurative sense, as for example, when we graze cattle on a field. Here, possession amounts to a kind of occupation. So then, the stability of society is founded in turn on stability in the possession of property. To this, Hume adds the already mentioned rules, the transference of property by consent, and the performance of promises. The observance of these three laws altogether is necessary for the security of human society. Social life is governed by conventions, and those conventions provide stability, and stability is what most men desire. Whatever the ultimate origin of a given political authority, and Hume cheerfully grants that most have originated in dubious circumstances, those that persist have obtained the sanction of prescription, and prescription is king. The order men require, therefore, is not based upon reason, but upon a kind of sentiment, and can be explained historically or psychologically or even anthropologically, but not purely rationally. Hume does not discount self-interest as a primary motivation for human conduct, but he is much more disposed to see our actions as conforming to what is, for individuals, a social given, which, like the language they speak, is not of their own making, but which, again, like the language they speak, is accepted as a brute social fact. Property is an artificial convention that can arise only when society reaches a certain level of material sophistication. The urgency to satisfy the immediate and pressing requirements of subsistence in a hunter-gatherer society prevents the emergence of anything but the most rudimentary conception of property, if even that. Here Hume and Adam Smith are in essential agreement. Smith believes that the notion of property probably begins to appear at the stage of husbandry, when herds of animals need to be controlled and protected. The notion of property comes into central focus with the invention of agriculture and fixed places of habitation. The concerted development of private property is to be found in early urban areas where people living close together found it necessary to define their separate possessions. The notion of private property arose gradually from a sense of the utility of the mutual recognition of claims of right to property. So writes Smith. Though private property may originate in the extended self-interest of individuals, the Mandevillean effect is to provide peace and social stability for all, despite its not being the design of any. Private property is, as it were, a product of cultural evolution, not an institution designed by anyone in particular, but a convention arising from the realized perception of its usefulness to all. In the context of the emergence of property, and with it the coeval notion of justice, law emerges also. Like language and morality, law too evolves coevally with the level of sophisticated social order. Smith believes that without property there can be no government. Suppose that, living alone on a desert island, one were to clear some ground, plant some carrots, and give them the tender loving care that they need until they were ready to be picked and eaten. In this case, wouldn't one own the carrots? I would rather say that if one were to live in such radical social isolation, one would neither own nor not own the carrots. The question of ownership simply wouldn't arise. But now, suppose another person were to appear and attempt to claim the carrots for himself. What then? In that case, one would be in a position to make a counterclaim that, all things considered, would seem to be better grounded than that of the challenger. In so doing, one would be attempting to actualize a kind of latent or virtual ownership that pre-existed any actual claim or recognition of that claim by others. It would seem that in the course of human history, after the first agricultural revolution, when people began to cultivate crops and domesticate animals, a significant amount of work was required to bring land under cultivation or to make it suitable for pasture. This work represented an expenditure of labour that could not easily be recovered if the one who expended it could legitimately be forced to give it up by others. Hunters and gatherers may have territory. Pastoralists have grazing and watering places. Agriculturalists have land, writes John Keegan. Once a man invests expectations of a regular return on his seasonal efforts in a particular place, lambing, herding, planting, reaping, he rapidly develops the sense of rights and ownership. Towards those who trespass on the places where he invests his time and effort, he must equally rapidly develop the hostility of the user and occupier for the usurper and interloper. Fixed expectations make for fixed responses. So writes Keegan. At this stage, however, we still have possession rather than property, or if property, then, as in my desert island illustration, virtual or latent property. That virtuality becomes actualized when other land users settle around the original user and, requiring undisturbed possession of their own tracts, are able to demand such only if there is mutual recognition, not just of the fact of possession, but of the right so to possess. In a word, a recognition of property. Acquisition and subsequent possession is a kind of virtual ownership which is transformed into actual ownership by means of the convention of reciprocal recognition. My settled use and reuse of my possessions requires you to refrain from interfering with them, but your use and reuse of your possessions also requires me to refrain from interfering with them. Mutual recognition of one another's exclusive control amounts to the transformation of factual possession into normative ownership. Cicero wrote that private property has been endowed not by nature, but by long-standing occupancy in the case of those who settled long ago on empty land, or by victory in the case of those who gained it in that way, or by law or bargain or contract or lot. since what was by nature common property has passed into the ownership of individuals, each should retain what has accrued to him, and if anyone seeks any of it for himself, he will transgress the law of the community. This process of mutual recognition of normative claims, of course, requires that the boundaries between adjacent properties be reasonably clearly demarcated, a requirement celebrated in the proverb that good fences make good neighbours. Carol Rose makes the case that a possessor of a given portion of land has an obligation to provide a persistent and unambiguous demarcation of that portion's boundaries. As people began to lay claims to territory, writes Schmitz and Brennan, and to mark by signs what they regarded as their territory, neighbours started, in some cases at least, to accommodate themselves to these claims. To do this, though, it had to be true that neighbours could discern and could afford to respect the boundaries of territorial claims. In order for it to be valid, the requirement of reciprocal recognition cannot sensibly be a universal requirement in some absolute spatial or temporal sense, but must be limited to one's proximate neighbours in space and time. The recognition of those who are geographically remote is not required, still less the recognition of those yet to be born. There are some who are less than enthusiastic about the propriety of the first come, first served principle in respect of land acquisition. The Tannehills, who are by no means uncritical of the Lockean labour-mixing metaphor as a criterion of resource acquisition, meet the disquiet of those who lack such enthusiasm by remarking, if the first comers were ambitious, quick and intelligent enough to acquire the property before anyone else, why should they be prevented from reaping the rewards of these virtues in order to hold the land open for someone else? Primary acquisition does not exclude others for all time, for it is not enough to have the luck and skill to acquire property. One must also have the luck and skill to hold on to it. And if a large chunk of land is acquired by a man who is too stupid or lazy to make a productive use of it, other men, operating within the framework of the free market, will eventually be able to bid it away from him and put it to work, producing wealth. Anthony de Jese is in sympathy with David Hume, who regarded initial exclusion as a simple matter of fact. For Hume, he writes, initial exclusion is a matter of fact. It happens by first occupation. At that point, society is formed by the first assignment to the present possessor. The morality of these steps is not at issue. What has all this to do with government or with the state? Well, property is necessary for society, and property depends on certain rules of justice. Men, some men at least, cannot seem to abide by these rules. The trouble with such men is that they prefer the present to the future, the immediate advantage to the long-term advantage. Men are not able radically to cure, either in themselves or others, that narrowness of soul which makes them prefer the present to the remote. That being so, although the long-term interests of all would be served by a strict observance of the laws of justice, some one person may seek his own advantage by their transgression. The solution to this problem is, Hume thinks, to make the observance of justice by everyone the immediate concern of some party. It is given then to some one or some group to execute the laws of justice and also to settle disputes. These are the basic functions of government. The same limited vision in respect of justice that requires the creation of government also prevents the emergence of any spontaneous form of large-scale cooperation, so that, in addition to its basic functions of the execution and the arbitration of justice, government must have the ability to perform public works that benefit all. Thus, bridges are built, harbours opened, ramparts raised, canals formed, fleets equipped, and armies disciplined, everywhere by the care of government, which, though composed of men subject to all human infirmities, becomes, by one of the finest and most subtle inventions imaginable, a composition which is, in some measure, exempted from all these infirmities. So writes Hume. Government, then, for Hume, as for Locke, is a remedy for the inconveniences of selfishness and the promoter of public goods that otherwise would not be provided. It would be carping to criticize Hume for not realizing that the deficiencies of human nature, which he sees so clearly operating at the primary social level, are likely to be replicated and amplified at the level of government. If individual men can be selfish and disordered in their private dealings, they can be equally selfish and disordered when entrusted with the provision of public order and justice and public goods. Who will guard the guardians? Despite the praise he gives government, Hume is surprisingly realistic about its contingent nature, remarking, "It is not necessary in all circumstances, nor is it impossible for men to preserve society for some time without having recourse to such an invention, namely government. The state of society without government is one of the most natural states of men, and must subsist with the conjunction of many families, and long after the first generation. If government is a remedy for the inconveniences attached to property, then in a society with little or no property, there is little incentive to discover the advantages of government. So natural is a society without government that nothing but an increase of riches and possessions could oblige men to quit it," writes Hume. We need government because it is useful. In small-scale societies, violations of justice are relatively easily remediable because men live face to face with each other. Radical non-cooperation will be sanctioned. An interest in reputation and the need for reciprocity is enough to give the normative force of promises, even without the existence of an external lawgiver threatening physical punishment. As society grows larger, however, these informal sanctions lose force and efficacy, as we may have little or no contact with others in that society. In that case, government is needed to bridge the gap. According to Kelly, government is needed not only to provide external legal sanctions when the force of informal sanctions diminishes. Government also has an educative function, that of extending our imaginative and sympathetic identification with many others. Government for Hume is not established by any form of explicit agreement or contract, but emerges slowly and gradually together with the society's increase in size and in wealth. Contract as a form of promising is a horizontal mode of relationship between individuals in a natural society, neither of whom claims to have the authority to command the other. The obligation to obey the civil magistrate is a vertical relationship in a civil society between one commissioned to enforce the laws of justice and those who are bound by those laws. To obey the civil magistrate is requisite to preserve order and concord in society, says Hume. To perform promises is requisite to beget mutual trust and confidence in the common offices of life. The ends, as well as the means, are perfectly distinct, nor is one subordinate to the other. All large civilized societies require government. Hume believes that, as a matter of fact, no government requires or finds it necessary to canvass the explicit or even the tacit consent of the governed, yet every government believes that those whom it governs are obliged to obey it. Hume is willing to grant that at the very beginning of a government among men there may have been a contract by which men bound themselves to obey, but he points out that once a government has been established for some considerable time, we simply suppose ourselves born to submission, and that those who are our governors have, by prescription, a right to command, and we a correlative obligation to obey. Time and custom give authority to all forms of government and all successions of princes, and that power, which at first was founded only on injustice and violence, becomes in time legal and obligatory. When it comes to providing a justification for government, one could hold either that such justification comes from a divine sanction or from the people by means of their agreement to be governed. If people want to insist that government is divinely sanctioned, Hume is not going to object, provided that such sanction is taken not to be a particular miraculous disposition of providence, but simply part of God's general plan for human subsistence, which requires the protection of government. Anyone who rules in whatever way, and in however humble a manner, can be said to act by divine commission. Hume remarks, "Nor has the greatest and most lawful prince any more reason, upon that account, to plead a peculiar sacredness or inviolable authority, than an inferior magistrate, or even an usurper, or even a robber and a pirate. A constable, therefore, no less than the king, acts by a divine commission, and possesses an indefeasible right. Having thus deflated the notion of any theory of divine right, Hume turns his attention to what he considers to be the major alternative theory of the justification of government, the original contract. Although taken to be a resolute critic of any notion of original contract, Hume in fact does allow that only by some such contract, properly understood, could government have received its start. He makes the point, as Hobbes has done before him, that men are more or less equal in their physical powers and their mental capacities, so that no natural inferiority could make them subordinate themselves to another man. That being so, if government were ever to arise, there had to have been an original agreement, express or implied, to this government on the part of the governed. If this then be meant by the original contract, it cannot be denied, says Hume, that all government is at first founded on a contract, and that the most ancient rude combinations of mankind were formed chiefly by that principle. Such consent, however, was fitful and opportunistic, relating more than likely to the effective leadership that is necessary in social emergencies such as war. No compact or agreement, it is evidenced, was expressly formed by general submission, an idea far beyond the comprehension of savages. Each exertion of authority in the chieftain must have been particular and called forth by the exigencies of the case. Why should one be loyal to a government, or why should one keep one's agreements? Both questions are equally pertinent. Hume's answer is that without some sentiment of political allegiance, however faint, and a general disposition to honour agreements, the sphere of justice, society would not be possible. Political structures provide order and contracts provide property, and without both order and the protection of property, civilized society could not function. Hume then grants that there may in fact have been an historical compact which was the origin of political society, but for him, whether or not this was so is of no great significance. Even had it been the case that our ancestors had agreed among themselves to associate in a particular way, that is no reason why such an agreement would be binding upon their successors. Hume claims that no extant government actually asks its citizens to agree to be governed. In a moment that is reminiscent of Hobbes, Hume believes that contracts and compacts bear on the relationships between individuals, not between individuals and their governments. As a matter of fact, Hume thinks governments subsist on the basis of a more or less inchoate feeling of loyalty or allegiance, rather than any idea of an agreement, whether explicit or tacit. While Hume concedes that there has to have been an element of contract or agreement, or as he says later, acquiescence, at the dim and distant birth of government in the remote past, he nevertheless holds that the situation obtaining at present in our sophisticated modern states cannot be construed on these terms. There are, he says, philosophers, presumably he has Locke in mind, who hold that not only that government in its earliest infancy arose from consent, or rather the voluntary acquiescence of the people, but also that even at present, when it has attained full maturity, it rests on no other foundation. They affirm that all men are still born equal and owe allegiance to no prince or government, unless bound by obligation and sanction of a promise. And as no man without some equivalent would forego the advantages of his native liberty and subject himself to the will of another, this promise is always understood to be conditional and imposes on him no obligation unless he meet with justice and protection from his sovereign.